I'm Connor Old, and welcome to another episode of Masters of Controlled Chaos. And today we're going to be looking at a more modern filmmaker, a filmmaker that is definitely maybe a little bit under the radar to most people. You know, of course, we're doing the series now. We're getting into a little more of the more niche directors. His new movie is coming out this week, Logan Lucky. He is the director of Ocean's 11, of Traffic, and of Aaron Brockovich. He is none other than Steven Soderbergh. Welcome back, guys. If you're new to the channel, what we do every single week is I break down a new filmmaker, and I talk about the general idea of what makes them great. I also look at what I consider their best movie, my favorite movie of theirs, and an underrated one of them. Sometimes they're all three different ones, especially in something like Steven Soderbergh's case, they actually are three different ones. Maybe sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. It all depends on what my favorite and what my opinions are. But let's jump right into what the general topic of the show, which is what makes him great. And what I love about Steven Soderbergh is that mostly he's a unique director in terms of, I don't know if Steven Soderbergh's really anyone's favorite director, but that doesn't mean he's still not a great director. He makes great movies, and he's not necessarily pigeonholed into one genre. He loves to take risks and does it quite often. We see something like Sex, Lies, and Videotapes. He comes out of the scene. He's the starter of the 90s rebel indie scene, as sort of documented in this book here, Rebels on the Backlot, a great book. You know, he's with the likes of Quentin Tarantino, David Fincher, sort of these 90s young wave of filmmakers that sort of spawned the rebel genre, or not the genre, but the rebel era of the 90s filmmakers. And Sex, Lies, and Videotapes was sort of the first one to do that, coming out in '89, winning the Cannes Film Festival of this definitely sort of unique, interesting movie. But then after that, he makes Kafka, a sort of like noir-ish movie. I watched it. It's in black and white, and there's a mystery going on, right? And then he goes into King of the Hill, which is a coming-of-age movie. And then he goes into Schizopolis, which is a huge, weird experimental film. And he sort of struggled after Sex, Lies, and Videotapes because he didn't make necessarily the best career choice of going into a big blockbuster or doing something else. He decided to experiment and sort of see, using the time that he had, because he had such a good head start, to sort of figure himself out and figure out what kind of movies he wants to make and where his strengths lie. Of course, something like Kafka is sort of more of a traditional one, but it's very different than, I think, Sex, Lies, and Videotapes. And that Kafka is very different than King of the Hill, which is a very sort of straightforward coming-of-age movie, which was very well done. And then something like Schizopolis, which is just, I'll talk about a little bit later, but just a crazy sort of experimental film that he did. But then he sort of gets maybe a little bit back on track when he makes Out of Sight. But that being said, just I think Soderbergh does a great job he doesn't necessarily have like a visual style or a distinct thing that makes him unique, but I think in general he makes great entertaining movies, but he also makes sort of like the blockbusters, but he also makes sort of these artsy fartsy type movies that and they're not really artsy-fartsy, but they're indie, they're smaller, they're a little bit maybe off-ball, a little bit weird. Like I said, he takes risks, he takes chances. You know, he's the same guy who can make Ocean's 11, this big blockbuster heist movie, but they can also make Solaris, which is like this sort of trippy sci-fi movie. He can also make Magic Mike, which is sort of a seemingly sort of entertaining movie, but it's like a world of male strippers. And that's what I really love about him, is that he always does different kinds of movies. You know, he does a lot of, say, crime movies or just biopics and stuff like that, but that doesn't mean his settings are the same. Some of them are completely different. Something Behind the Candelabra, the extravagant life of Liberace and his lovers. You know, Magic Mike, just the world of male strippers, which really wasn't done before. Out of Sight in Ocean's 11 is sort of like the crime underworld of like the heist ability of it. You know, he did Shay Part 1 and 2, which is about the Cuban Revolution. Traffic, which is about the entire drug industry. Aaron Brockovich, which is like a court lawyer room drama. And they all have sort of sometimes underlying themes of crime, but that doesn't mean the settings and the different types of movies. Like you can say Magic Mike and Traffic are the same movie, and it's hard to distinguish that. This is actually the same director that directs all these, because he's not Tim Burton, he's not Wes Anderson, where it's so visually apparent, or he's not even something like a Cameron Crowe or a Billy Wilder, which we talked about last 2 weeks, where their dialogue is so sort of distinctive and you can sort of tell. Even when I'm watching a lot of his movies, I'm like, is this really the same guy? Really the only thing you can tell is that he's just a great director. He likes telling great stories, interesting stories that interest him, and that could be a whole variety of things. And you know, something like last week we talked about Billy Wilder and his ability to mix genres into one movie. So we talked about Stanley Kubrick or Rob Reiner, where they do individual movies of genres. Well, Steven Soderbergh does that, but he doesn't. It's interesting because he sticks to a sort of genre of the sort of crime genre, sort of biopic genre, but he's not like a David Fincher where it's very dark and brooding. You can tell his style is very much a Steven Spielberg style, I feel, though, where he sort of stays out of it and doesn't create a super big landmark and wants to create entertaining movies and will do what is necessary to create the best movie possible. And then, if just going back into the experimental part, people sort of thought that, oh, once he made Out of Sight, then he sort of became this mainstream successor, and I don't really think so. You know, something like Haywire is a different action film, and the height of the Bourne Identity, and or not in the height of the Bourne Identity, but the Bourne Ultimatum sort of that created this genre of even something like Captain Phillips, which I believe came out in the same year, or no, came out years later. A couple years later. It's just this sort of, we all know, this fast-paced action movie editing, because the Bourne Identity sort of started that. All action movies were sort of like fast-paced, and out going all over the place. And just now we're starting to see something with John Wick a couple years ago, and now John Wick Chapter 2 and Atomic Blonde, the sort of letting it go back and seeing the incredible stunts and seeing really the action. Haywire did that sort of first in 2011, where it just the camera's back and you see incredible stunts with Gina Carano, I believe. I forget how to pronounce her name, but she's a former UFC fighter turned actress, and she does incredible stunt work, all her own stunts, and you can allow her to sort of stay in the frame and just not cut away and just see the great action moves, sort of typical to old like kung fu films. You know, that's why people love Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan, or, you know, all those guys, because they could just do their own their stunts, and you don't need to cut around the action with fast pace to make it seem like something's happening and seem more like intense. All you can do is just actually do the work and then show that's intense. So that's 2011, which was a sort of an experimental action movie. You take something like Out of Sight, which is a sort of a weird action romance that's not really a crime movie, and it sort of plays with the editing. And then you also have something like he's doing right now, where he's shooting a movie on an iPhone, a secret movie on an iPhone with Claire Foy. That should be really interesting too. I'm excited for that. But I just mentioned here his editing. And I think that's something that I want to point out, is that I think he has a total grasp of his editing, and he's not afraid to create different things. He's great at creating ensemble pieces and character pieces, but in terms of his editing, he can create linear stories, something like Aaron Brockovich, which is very simple, or something like The Limey in 1999, the year before Aaron Brockovich, which is very much sort of disjointed and sort of the timeline's all messed up, and it works because of that benefit. Also something like Traffic, which is very much not non-linear editing. It's just different sort of storylines going on at once and weaving it through that in a sort of melody, sort of melodic sort of way of going through each storyline and keeping the sort of story progressing forward. Does an incredible job at that. So I think he has a really reign over his editing. He's not afraid to sort of change up his editing or try new things, and that just goes back to the sort of the risks that he takes. And he's not creating these incredible sort of changing the genre, but it's these risks that sort of allow him to become a great filmmaker. And he really has, you know, captured the zeitgeist at certain moments, that because of his interesting sort of risks that he's taken. Sex, Lies, and Videotapes totally captured the zeitgeist and created this sort of 90s rebel and young indie filmmaker movement. And then something like in the 2000s, I think, was really, he created the transition of the modern movie. I think Aaron Brockovich in Traffic, which came out 17 years ago, yet they feel very modern. Even Haywire was sort of ahead of its time. A lot of stuff's maybe ahead of its time. He's sort of the starter of a lot of the things. That's why, because he takes those risks, he can start those things when it works. You know, I love the year of 2000 because, you know, or create really in 1998, his comeback, Out of Sight. Then he makes The Limey, another great movie. Then he makes Aaron Brockovich and Traffic, both in the same year. And he gets nominated for Best Directing for Aaron Brockovich and Traffic. So he was up against himself in the Best Directing category. He actually won that, and Traffic won Best Picture. But really, and then after that, he wins an Oscar. And then what does he put out? Ocean's 11, which is this big box office hit. Like, he just totally captured this cultural zeitgeist really well. And then we're sort of trusting him ever since, and you know, he's made incredible TV shows like The Nick. You know, he was Logan Lucky was supposed to be Not Gonna Ever Happen. Side Effects was supposed to be his last TV movie, and he says movies are dead, all about TV. And then he goes to The Nick and makes this incredible TV show. Unfortunately, it's finished now, but he really directs 20 episodes, I think, and really puts his labor of love into that TV show, which is an incredibly directed TV show. And I think that's one thing that I want to point out about Steven Soderbergh. Yes, he's an incredible screenwriter, but he definitely has sort of abandoned the screenwritingness of it and has decided to just take scripts and just be solely directors, because he's also the DP, director of photography, the cinematographer on a lot of his movies. but just being able to sort of take scripts that fit him and fit well, and maybe that's why not his distinctiveness is not there. Maybe if he wrote all of his movies, he'd be a little more of an auteur, but that doesn't mean he still isn't a great director and has such a hone over the directing craft. And then another thing I want to point out is just that I love how he's sort of in the middle, where he's not too mainstream and he's not too indie sort of artsy fartsiness. He sort of occupies this really interesting space that nobody else has really necessarily done, and he doesn't really commit to either side. He can do one here, he can do one there, and he's definitely varied in that sense. And just I think a lot of his movies, for the most part, are consistently good. And for me, like, I'm about to say my best and my favorite, but it was so hard for me because I could pick any one of his movies. Like, I think depending on who you are, you would love Schizopolis, or you could love Out of Sight, or you could be like, no, I really love Contagion. That was really a great movie of mine. I know IndieWire, when I was searching online, did a list of asking a bunch of different critics what their favorite Steven Soderbergh movie was, and it was all over the place. Out of Sight and Contagion. Some people said Kafka, some people said King of the Hill, Schizopolis, The Informant. It was just all over the place because it's so hard to nail down. And especially for me, I had that same thing because he makes such different movies, and he has such a great sort of landscape of great movies. I probably consider him to have at least 10 great movies, which is really hard for a filmmaker to do. You don't really have their prime, but he's still churning out movies. He's still doing great stuff. And I think Logan Lucky, from what the early reviews are, turns out to be like an Ocean's 14, which looks out pretty good. But now let's move on to what I consider his best movie, Traffic. Now, why I consider Traffic his best movie is because this was hard for me, because I could have gone Out of Sight, or it could have been more of a character piece, something like Behind the Candelabra, which I think is often overlooked. But I still think it's Traffic just because the incredible directing of it. This is actually a masterfully directed movie. The way he does little things, like how he's able to tell the story, which was based on a 6-part miniseries, and tell that in a sort of cohesive way in a 2.5-hour movie. He takes the sort of epic scale of the drug war, and using multiple storylines, tells how it affects different people and how really it gets from, say, Mexico and gets onto the corner of Cincinnati. And of course, there's the great line in there where it's just like, it's easier to get drugs than it is to get alcohol. And just tackling this war on drugs, which was so prevalent in the 2000s and is still raging on today with things like the legalization of marijuana and the controversy around that. But so you have this sort of epic scale of the war on drugs, and how he sort of takes it as a documentary style, and he just presents it to the viewer, and he doesn't say anything about it. It's very documentary-esque in that, where he's trying to be very unbiased. It's very unpreachy. You can look at other movies to see how hard this was to do. You look at this movie, and it's like, wow, this is like, it's not necessarily emotional. It's not. It has emotional scenes, but it's not like this super preachy or trying to say stuff like, oh my God, drugs are so bad, we need to crack down on this. He's not necessarily taking a stand, but he's sort of using that documentary sense of just capturing. He says capturing instead of blocking, instead of staging. He just captures stuff. There was only 4 tripod shots in the entire movie. He does a lot of he's his own DP, so he did a lot of the shoulder shots, just moving around in this great interview here, which he did. You can find on YouTube to search up Steven Soderbergh interview Traffic. And really just talks about how he wanted to create that documentary feel, and I think does a great job of not being preachy and of just telling the audience this is what happens. And of course you have the great ensemble cast of Catherine Zeta-Jones and Michael Douglas and Benicio del Toro, and I just think that every little player in this movie does an incredible job. It's definitely a dramatic movie. It's a serious movie, undoubtedly, and there's emotional parts for sure, but you really connect to these characters, and that's why I love something that Dunkirk actually did pretty well. My favorite movie of the year so far. I'm a big fan of it. What it did so well is sort of captured the epicness and the macro scale of the war and the macro scale of Dunkirk by telling these individual stories. I think Traffic does that incredibly well. They take the increasing sort of huge drug war trade into 6-hour sort of part series for BBC that's based on, and it's like, how do you condense that in a 2.5-hour movie? And he does this really expertly by just taking sort of these different storylines of different people, of Benicio del Toro, who's a cop who sort of gets caught up in the wrong web of people and has to do that sort of the drugs, taking it to the States, and then, you know, all the way to the user of the girl, and then Michael Douglas is the father dealing with the girl of the sort of the rich family that has the obsession to coke and all that stuff, and to the guy on the corner street that he has to just meet up with, and all the little things where it takes we really care about these characters and care about their well-being, but you do that, and while you're learning about sort of not necessarily their backstories, but their struggles with drugs, you can sort of take a back look at see the sort of epic scale of it. So he does an incredible job, similar to Dunkirk in that reason. And I want to point out one scene that I just love, that I think does a great job at just showing you the masterclass in directing of the movie, where Benicio del Toro's character, they make a scene and they put it in a pool because it just shows that he doesn't have a wire on or he's not mic'd up, and that's sort of an assurance that he's not being recorded or anything. And that's just a small thing, but it's such an interesting decision because they're just floating in the water and they're talking, and instead of having a conversation which is very generic, which is just you sit here, someone sits there, shot, reverse shot, back and forth, that's sort of boring. He creates very interesting scenarios, and I think a lot of filmmakers are always talk about setting and scenarios that are so important. Something like Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights, where they had the drug deal going on, and the Filipino guy that's throwing the firecrackers, and just they're playing Jesse's Girl in the background, and he's singing. It's just like this incredible scenarios, and Steven Soderbergh does a great job at creating different sort of scenarios that allow things to make sense, sort of narratively, but also just making it fresh and unique, so it's not feels like it's dragged on. Okay, now let's move over to his favorite movie. My favorite movie of his, which was really hard for me. I was on the brink of going maybe Out of Sight, maybe Ocean's 11, maybe Schizopolis, but I eventually went with The Informant with Matt Damon, a little bit of a different obscure choice. I love Matt Damon, and this is an incredible role for him. He plays this super weird, oddball character where he's contradictory all the time. He's lying to himself. The FBI doesn't understand his reasoning. His wife doesn't even understand his reasoning. I don't even know if he understands his reasoning. And just, I love how Steven Soderbergh can do an ensemble piece, but he can really do this great character piece, and just the goofy sort of brilliance of this movie is so much fun. And you know, you love the character of Mark Whitaker, and I love sort of strange, interesting, strong individual protagonists. And I think this is a really interesting protagonist that you should want to spend all your time with. And of course, Steve Soderbergh uses narration in a really interesting way, using it as a comedic voice instead of sort of an explanation voice to more understand his character, his frame of mind. And you sort of get in his frame of mind and you ask yourself, what would you do in that situation? Or sometimes you question, like, what is he doing? Why did he do that? And it's based on an incredible true story. You know, it's based on a true story, sort of. You know what I mean? It's not really a true story. Like, it's the events happened, but the events were dramatized. It's sort of like you see this. It's one of those news stories where you're reading, you're like, why would he do that? So stupid. But then you get into the character's mind, you realize sort of the snowball effects that happen, and just super interesting character played brilliantly by Matt Damon. I think he should have gotten an Oscar nomination for this because he is just so sort of bland and generic, and he's totally has a lot of money. He makes like $350,000 a year. He drives Ferraris, has a beautiful mansion, but doesn't like sort of boast about that, and just seems like a regular sort of desk clerk guy, and sort of he gets agitated at certain points, and I just really love him, and I just think he does a great job at that. And so now just an underrated one is Schizopolis, which was almost my favorite, just because it's an incredibly personal film. It's super experimental. It's weird. It's a sort of a satire using black comedy on a sort of breakdown of society and the rules and communication and how we perceive that, and just using sort of different sort of tropes and then reversing them, like simple things like, oh, how are you doing? Terrible, thanks. And then just like there's a great scene of Steven Soderbergh, who's in the movie, he stars in the movie, and I don't think you know his name, but he goes home to his wife and he's just like, instead of saying what they're going to be saying, they say things like, oh, what is it? It's like greetings, and then greetings reprised, and then, oh, insert statement of great day at work, or something like that, where instead of saying like, oh hi honey, and then hi honey back, and then I had a great day at work, he uses things like descriptors of what they're going to say. Just a weird sort of movie. He shot this with no script on a budget that's really low, that's super experimental, but it's really funny, and it's on the Criterion Collection, which is some sort of seal of approval, and I really enjoy it. And I just think it's a hyper-personal movie to him, and it's just really funny. And that's why I think I love about Steven Soderbergh's movies. You have the slick, sort of cool style of Out of Sight and Ocean's trilogy, except for Ocean's 12. I hate that movie. But I think I just sort of like the weirder, sort of funnier movies like Schizopolis, like The Informant, even something like Behind the Candelabra, which is sort of strange and offbeat. And there's something really charming about that I think Soderbergh has definitely been able to channel. And I think that's why I love going back to this risk. He wouldn't be able to make The Informant if he didn't make Schizopolis. And he wouldn't be able to make Beyond the Candelabra if it weren't for The Informant. And sort of how little things exceed his career. Logan Lucky is like a heist movie, and he wouldn't have been able to make that if it weren't for the 3 Oceans movies and even Out of Sight. And but for all those reasons, that's why Steven Soderbergh is a master of controlled chaos. If you like the video, make sure you like the video, comment below, let me know what your favorite Steven Soderbergh movie is. Are you going to see Logan Lucky? I know I am, and that should be a fun time. But anyways, guys, I'm Connor Old, and until next time, stay tuned.